All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back, and now I'm very pleased to present to you my guest here in the studio with me, John Kenneth Blackwell. He's the former Secretary of State for the state of Ohio. He had an unsuccessful bid as the Republican nominee for governor of Ohio in the 2006 election. He was the first African American to be candidate for governor of a major party in Ohio. And he's here to discuss with me and with you, by the way. Feel free to call in. Matter of fact, we encourage telephone calls. The Second Amendment and the decision that just came down from the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. Blackwell, first of all, welcome to the show.
Hey, Gordon, it's always good to be with you.
Always good to have you. Before we went on the air, during the commercial break there, we were pointing out to each other, so to speak, something that was pretty obvious, but was noted in the editorial in the Wall Street Journal today. Just one vote changed, and they would have eviscerated the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. And you pointed out, and you're certainly right, how important that makes whom we select in November as the next president of the United States, because, as you pointed out, that person will have maybe 3 appointees.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it just elevates this issue in the presidential election substantially, because while we celebrate what was clearly the right decision of the court on yesterday concerning the Second Amendment, it was not the complete victory that we might have wanted. It established clearly that this was an individual right, not a right of the government-sponsored militia.
Yeah.
But it was an individual right that each American has a right to enjoy. A close reading does not suggest that it established it as a fundamental right, which would require strict scrutiny to change. And in some areas that they didn't get into, for instance, in terms of licensing and regulating, would suggest that the left, as already evidenced by the actions and verbiage of the mayor of D.C., that they're going to try to build an unscalable wall of complication around the licensing procedure and the regulations governing our exercise of that individual right. So this is the first round, and we clearly won the first round. There was a major and substantial advancement, if I can stay with sports metaphors, of the ball down the field in this struggle. But we should take a moment to celebrate, then catch our breath, and be ready for a protracted legal struggle.
Press on. You know, when I was doing my preparations for a book I wrote a few years ago, and I was researching gun control, and what I wanted to find out was, where did the first idea of even having gun control come from? Because it was obvious that back in those days when the country was being formed and everything, everybody had a firearm, and there wasn't a question about it. And what I found is that the first hint of it was when there were freedmen who were slaves, had been freed by their owners, and the white people said, well, all right, you're going to free your slave, okay, but we're not going to let him have a firearm. And that's where it started, to restrict black people from having a firearm.
Absolutely. It was an outgrowth, an an extension of the Black Codes. It abbreviated the liberties, the civil liberties and basic rights of these newly freed slaves. And Gordon, if you sort of take a look at the civil rights history in this country, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, what you find was that the first advocates for, not necessarily the first, but some of the strongest advocates of Second Amendment rights and freedoms came from a group of World War II veterans who were African Americans who lived in Louisiana, who saw the Klan and others just run through their communities, wreaking and violence. They were called the Deacons of Defense. And these African American World War II veterans basically said that they weren't going to be just dependent on the local law enforcement, which they were suspicious of, to protect their families and their property. And guess what? They were some of the early success stories of the civil rights movement, just by claiming a basic right and freedom that was guaranteed by the Second Amendment. And that's why I find it interesting that you now have George Soros and Mayor Bloomberg and others putting millions and millions of dollars in non-for-profit groups to advocate the taking away of law-abiding citizens' rights to protect their property and their families. And I think it's shameful, and I say that not just as an American, not just as an African American. I said as a former mayor of a big city. I was mayor of Cincinnati, and I know that you can put police officers on every corner of every street, and the criminal element will still figure out a way, how to steal and murder and do those things that do violence to communities and destroy the sense of safety. But you allow for law-abiding people to protect themselves. And you see a decrease in the success of the criminal element.
Yeah, and here in Washington D.C., they had what I think is the strictest gun ban in the country.
Absolutely.
And the rationale for that was, look, we've got all of this violence committed with the instrumentality of a handgun here in Washington, and it had no effect whatsoever. I mean, the bad guys all had guns, shooting to death 2 and 3 people per weekend often, and yet they persisted in this myth that
it's nonsense.
Yeah, and meanwhile, the vast majority of the population of the District of Columbia, who are honest, hard-working people, are like cowering in their front porches and what have you, unarmed because they obey the law, and the bad guys, I mean, it always.
Well, you're absolutely right. They disarm law-abiding citizens, and it is advantage bad guys.
Yeah.
and we don't tend to understand that if you look at the data. Look at the data. Yeah. And the data would suggest that Washington D.C. Is still among the nation's leading cities when it comes to gun violence.
Oh, yeah.
But what we do know is that the government has disarmed the good guys.
Exactly. And when you call them on it, they say, well, it's the fault of Virginia or Maryland because that's where the guns are coming from. And, the bad guys' guns come from stealing guns. All right, let's take some calls here, folks. The telephone number is 1-800-GG-LIDDY, 1-800-445-4339. Now, in Mr. Blackwell, I have the former mayor of a major city, Cincinnati, Ohio, a man who's really knowledgeable, from actual experience of what goes on in our cities and the violence committed with handguns and what works and what doesn't. So you got an expert here. You give us a call, 1-800-GG-LIDDY. From South Dakota on I-29, Brad, you're on here.
Morning, G. Gordon. Love your show.
Thank you, sir.
I just had a couple points. I've heard so much on both sides, they're banning about this word militia. And if I remember historically, a militia, you brought your own weapons, you brought your own musket, your own horse, your own food if you had it. They didn't provide that. And also, the liberals always say, they're protecting your rights. An example is the FISA courts. They think, somebody's going to be listening to somebody. But when it comes up to one of the most basic rights, which is the right to bear arms, they're against that. And then I also heard that Dianne Feinstein wants to start fingerprinting people if they want to get a mortgage. So I'll hang up and listen to your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I hadn't heard that thing about Dianne Feinstein wanting to fingerprint mortgagees. I'm not sure what purpose.
Well, look, there is an alignment of forces of liberalism, whether it's Bloomberg in New York, Feinstein in California, or the mayor here in D.C. Look, the line of distinction has really become crystallized as of yesterday's decision. It is now an individual right, without question. We must be forever vigilant because they're going to shift their points of attack.
Yeah.
Barack Obama has thrown up his hands. He's saying, I've always known it to be an individual right. Well, when he had an opportunity, for instance, to sign on with a bipartisan group of members of Congress who offered an amicus brief to the court on this case, he took a pass. John McCain didn't. He signed on, and so I would think if you begin to look at Senator Obama's alignment with those who tend to be judicial activists, those who tend to be far left, almost, and in some cases, radicals, it would suggest that this false election will portend to the future of gun rights in this country. Because if he wins, on the advice of Mayor Bloomberg and others and George Soros, his appointees will make yesterday's decision mute with their answers to questions that weren't answered yesterday, and those regulations and licensing procedures, perhaps with the urging to make those things more burdensome and discouraging of gun ownership. On the other hand, if you look at who's advising Mr. McCain, I think we will build on yesterday's decision for freedom.
All right. My guest, ladies and gentlemen, is John Kenneth Blackwell, former Secretary of State of the state of Ohio, former mayor of Cincinnati, Ohio. He's the first African-American to be a candidate for governor of a major party in Ohio. He's an expert on these questions because he's been there and he's done that and he's got the T-shirt. All right, folks, we're back. My guest is John Kenneth Blackwell, former Secretary of State of the state of Ohio, former mayor of Cincinnati, the city of Cincinnati in Ohio, and a member of the board of directors of the National Rifle Association. And we're talking about the Second Amendment. I have to throw this in, Mr. Blackwell. I learned the other day that if we wanted to provide all the electrical power needed by the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, it would require that we totally covered the state of Connecticut with those big windmill things.
Well, Gordon, that was kind of. I thought you were going to say something like what Mark Twain said about Cincinnati. He was after his third visit, he was on a train ride, and a young man from Louisville, a journalist from Louisville, was interviewing him and said, "What was your impression of Cincinnati?" And he said, "Son, if I heard the world was ending tomorrow, I would get to Cincinnati as fast as I could because things happen there 10 years after they happen in the rest of the world." So thank you for your very kind consideration of our energy source. But let me tell you, Gordon, one of the things that I enjoy that I'm doing now, I have taken over the chairmanship of the Coalition for Conservative Majority. And those in your listening audience who are interested in looking at what we're all about can go to ccmajority.org.
CC Majority.
And we are right now in about 8 media markets, and we are advancing a conservative agenda. We're going to help to brighten the line of distinction between the world that conservative policies and a conservative worldview would shape, and that which the left and now their leader, Mr. Obama, would provide us, and we think that distinction is sharp, and we think that most Americans, most voters will choose our vision for America. We have to make sure that conservatives and conservative candidates are true to those things and that they run on. And one of the principles of liberty and constitutional rights include the right to bear arms and our Second Amendment.
All right. Well, I think, unfortunately, we have run out of time, Mr. Blackwell. Folks, I want you to remember that website, ccmajority.org. That's the Coalition for a Conservative Majority. And, Mr. Blackwell, I'm grateful to you for sharing your time with us. I've always enjoyed it. And, boy, I got so much I'd talk to you about. I could just,
I'll have to come back, Gordon.
Always
good to be with you.
You got to come back. Thank you, sir.
All right. God bless.
This is the G. Gordon Liddy Show.